Hi guys, so today we are doing a quick Google Sheets tutorial. You guys will be learning how to input equations into Google Sheets in order to solve for kinetic energy and potential energy. Then I will just help you set up your final spreadsheet that you guys will be using throughout this lab. So Google Sheets is a really helpful tool because it speeds up calculations and actually the computer does it for you. So I'm going to be showing you a little bit about how to do that. Now, in order to start, we need to write down our two givens. The two givens that we have in this lab that will never change are the acceleration due to gravity, which is a 9.8 meters per second squared, and then we have the mass of our car. Now, some of you may not have this exact mass. I have 0.041 kilograms. However, that is the mass that I'm going to be using in today's tutorial, okay? So we're going to start very simple. We're going to start with kinetic energy. So let's just take a minute to think about what is kinetic energy. Kinetic energy, we have talked about this a little bit. The kinetic energy formula is equal to 1/2, so that's 0.5, m for mass, and then v squared. Now to put v squared in here, I want to be really careful so that I don't square my mass as well. You can put them in parentheses like this, and I just put a little caret to be v squared. One thing about Google Sheets is you can see what you put in this little box up here on the line, so you don't have to cram to see everything. Okay, so this is just a reminder that kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 mass velocity squared. So when you do your lab, you are going to be finding two different velocities. There's going to be the starting velocity, and then there's going to be the measured velocity, which is going to be your final velocity. Okay. So according to our equation of kinetic energy, we just need to have mass, which I have given you, and velocity, which is what your recordings will say. So I'm just going to make up some data over here just so I can show you how to actually input the equation for kinetic energy into Google Sheets. So I'm just going to make a heading here. I'm going to say V0. So what that stands for is initial velocity. And then I'm going to have VF for final velocity because we are measuring two separate ones. And then I'm going to calculate kinetic energy, okay? Now, if I am calculating kinetic energy and I have VO here and I have VF here, I'm probably going to have two separate kinetic energies. I'll have a kinetic energy using VO as well as a kinetic energy using VF. So just to clear things up, I'm going to make this kinetic energy, but I'm going to make this the initial kinetic energy. Okay, so I'm just going to make this K0, K initial. Okay, and then for final kinetic energy, I'm just going to make it just like this, just a small notation so you guys know what is what. All right, so VO, if you guys think about it, when you're starting your car on this ramp, the starting velocity is going to be 0 meters per second. Then let's say I have my car go down the ramp and it reads the final velocity of 1.4, okay? So I'm making up these numbers, you guys. You will have your own data. So now I'm ready to find my kinetic energy. I've got my initial, I've got my final, and I've got my mass. Those are all the variables I need for kinetic energy. So to solve for kinetic energy, we have to input the equation. Now instead of writing down the equation step by step, you can actually input the equation into Excel and it will solve for you. So this is how you do it. First, you have to start with an equal sign. Equals, meaning you're telling Google Sheets to actually calculate something. So we know kinetic energy is 0.5 mass velocity squared. So I'm going to put 0.5. So because it's in blue there, you guys can see that they're getting ready to calculate. Now I want to multiply by mass. Now I can't just put mass in, so I actually have to use the multiplication. You will put in a multiplication sign. Usually it's like that little asterisk star looking thing on your keyboard. That means multiply. And I want to multiply by the mass. Now my mass is 0.041, but instead of writing that in every single time, in a calculation, you can just put a parentheses and then click on that box, and that tells me that I want to use the mass, which is B2, okay? got my mass, and I want to put that in end parentheses. It will kind of become bold, so you know that B2 and only B2. And the last thing is I want to multiply that by velocity squared. So I want to multiply again. Now, since I'm solving for kinetic energy initial, I need to use initial velocity, okay? So V squared. Now, I'm using V initial, so I'm going to just, again, you can just click on the box. You don't have to type anything in. So I can just click it in like that. And then I want to square that number. So again, I'm just going to use the little caret and square it. And then you need to end parentheses. Make sure that you end your parentheses or you're going to have a calculator error. Now that I'm ready, you can just hit enter and it will solve. I got 0. Now, one helpful hint, you guys. If you have something that's going to remain the same, like mass or acceleration due to gravity, you want to make sure that it stays the same in every single calculation. The way to do that is you actually put money signs before and after the letter. So I would put a money sign with B in front of B, and then a money sign in front of 2. It won't change my calculation. It will just be really helpful later, and it will come in handy. So make sure you guys put the money sign when you use mass, and then when you use acceleration due to gravity. Okay, now let's calculate for kinetic energy final. Once again, you guys should be pretty ready to do this now that we've done kinetic energy initial. You do equals, I do 0.5, I multiply by my mass. Don't forget, you want to do parentheses, mass, end parentheses, it will become bold, times, and then my final velocity squared. I want to do parentheses, final velocity, caret, and then squared. End parentheses, it will bold so that you know that you're doing everything right. When you're ready, hit enter. I found a final kinetic energy of 0.04018. Now, once again, mass is something that always stays the same. So I want to put the money signs before and after the letter, okay? So it didn't change my answer, just kept it. It will keep it the same. So I'm going to show you why putting the money signs is important. Let's say I do 2, 3 more trials, okay? My initial velocity is 0, then let's say my final velocity was 4, then let's say I do another one and the initial velocity is 0 and the final velocity is 2.7. I'm making this up as I go. So now I have more data, which means I have to calculate kinetic energy initial and kinetic energy final again. However, you might be thinking, it's going to be so tedious if I have to put in the equation over and over and over again. The great thing about Excel, you guys, is once you have the first equation, the equation won't change, just the cell number. So instead of A5, it should be A6, A7. Instead of B5, I should have B6 or B7. It'll be the same equation. Now, the greatest thing about Excel is that I can just take this little dot here and pull down and let go, and it will calculate everything the same. So let's just double check. I'm looking at my second trial here, and I have 1/2, that's good, times mass, the same mass. Putting those money signs allowed it to stay the same, but you'll see here that instead of A5, it says A6. It corresponds with the correct row that it should be in. Again, same thing here, it moved down to A7. So it's not so important here with kinetic energy initial because all of it will be 0, but when it comes in handy is when you get to final and you actually have calculations like this, okay? Now, I calculated it. The only thing that changed is instead of having 1.4 in B5, I used 4 meters per second, which is in B6, okay? So that's why you want to put the money signs in, because by putting the money sign in, I said, even though you can change the other cells as I go down, don't ever change the mass or cell B2, okay? So that's pretty much how you do kinetic energy. Now that we've learned to solve for kinetic energy, you guys will also be in charge of making graphs. Before I do it though, I just want to make my data a little bit more clean. You guys can see here I have multiple decimals, decimal places after the 0. So if you want to change that, you guys, up here you guys see decimal places. This says decrease decimal, this says increase. So I want to decrease my decimal places, and I want to make them all the same. So let's say I just make them to 3, just like that. I get 0.04, 0.328, and 0.149, okay? That's just one way to make sure your data looks clean and ready to go. So now I'm ready to make a graph. Let's say I want to look at the graph of kinetic energy initial and kinetic energy final, and I want to look at just trial 1. Just trial 1, okay? What you're going to do after highlighting what you want, you're going to put insert. You're going to go down to chart. Now that you're at chart, you're going to see all this crazy stuff. You want to be under chart types. You want to scroll down, and you want to pick column chart. This is the kind of chart that I want. I want a column chart. Now that I'm there, I just want to double check the data range that I picked. So you can hit select data range. Move this out of the way. They're saying out of the data, I want to go from C4, which is this, to D5. That's exactly what I want. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to hit insert. So you guys can see here that I now have my chart, just like that. Chart title, you guys can add this. This would be kinetic energy trial 1, and maybe you say initial and final. Then you hit enter to apply, and you're good to go. You can label your axes down here, you guys. Once again, you just type in there and you label them. One thing that's really important is you do need to highlight the actual K initial and K final so that it comes up in your legend here. Now you may be like, where is K initial? If it's blue, I don't see anything. That's because based on our trial, K initial is 0, so there is no actual column graph to show us, okay? My K final, though, was 0.04, and if you look at this, what's great about Excel is they've already graphed it for me. I don't have to do any of the scaling, but I'm at 0.04, and that is showing me how much kinetic energy I had from my mass times final velocity, okay? So this is part 1. You just have to know how to make a kinetic energy equation within Excel as well as a kinetic energy graph. Now that you guys have learned how to do kinetic energy in Google Sheets, we're going to talk about potential energy. So once again, I'm going to write down my givens. Acceleration due to gravity is 9.8, and my mass of my cart is going to be the same, 0.041, okay? So let's just briefly write down the equation. Potential energy, we often see potential energy expressed as UG. And the equation for potential energy is UG, or potential energy is equal to mass times gravity times height, mgh, okay? Very straightforward. Now, when you do this lab, you are going to have some sort of incline that your cart goes down so that you can measure velocity before and after. So if we have an incline, that means we're going to have some sort of initial height that the car starts at, some sort of final height that the cart ends at when we measure the final velocity. So one heading that you will definitely need for potential energy is initial height, and you will also need final height. And then we need mass, which is something that's going to stay the same, and gravity, which will also stay the same. So once again, just like in kinetic energy, if I have an initial height and a final height, I will have an initial potential energy. So I'm going to make this UGO, UG0. That's potential energy initial, and then potential energy final, just like I did in kinetic energy. So I'm going to make up some data of initial height and final height just so we can see what happens to potential energy and so you guys can get practice. So let's say I have an initial height of 0.4 meters and my final height after going down the ramp is 0.15 meters. Let's just go with that. Now, to calculate, once again, we have to set up our equation. So I'm going to first start with my equal sign telling Google Sheets that I'm ready to do a calculation. Google Sheets is going to ask me what I want to do. So equals, I want to do mass times gravity times height. Now mass is something that I always want to keep the same. So I want to go back and maybe put some money signs in there. I want to multiply that with the star asterisks. Multiply that by gravity, which is also something that I want to be staying the same. And then multiply again by my initial height. Okay, I'm looking at initial potential energy, so I use my initial height, which is A5, end parentheses. Make sure, you guys, that you don't forget your parentheses around here. That's going to be really important. Otherwise, it will mess up your calculations. Okay? When you're ready, hit enter. I got 0.16072 as an initial potential energy. Okay? Now I'm ready to calculate my final energy. Once again, I'm doing mass times gravity times height. I've got my mass right here. I'm multiplying that by my gravity, multiplying that by my final height, which is B5, end parentheses, and I hit enter. So I've got my final potential energy and I've got my initial potential energy. Now, like I said, acceleration due to gravity and mass, B1 and B2, are both things that I want to keep the same when I drag down to use this formula for other data. So I'm going to put the money signs in between B2, which is my mass, and B1, which is my acceleration due to gravity. Just click enter, it will stay the same. I also want to just double, triple check and put the money signs in here as well. Sometimes they're not always necessary, but it's better to be safe than to recalculate over and over and over. Okay, so that is how you use an equation for potential energy. Let's test out our data and do some other initial and final heights. So let's say my new initial height, let's say I raised it even higher, is 0.56. Let's say I leave 0.15. All I have to do is drag. You look at this little dot, blue dot, take it so the cursor looks like this, drag it down, boom, got another calculation. Drag it down. Okay, great. Now I already have another initial potential and a final potential energy. So, not too hard, right? So let's actually try again, and we are going to make another column graph so that we can analyze some of our data. Once again, I want to look at the difference between initial and final. And instead of just looking at one trial, I want to look at both trials. So I'm going to highlight all of that. So do you guys remember what to do? You're going to go to Insert. You're going to go down to Chart. Then once it opens up to Chart, you want to make sure that you get to Chart Types. Chart Types. Go down, down, down. Double check that you're on the column one. This is what it should look like. Then once again, I want to double check here that I've got the right data range, which is all of this. I'm looking at both trials. I'm good to go. Let's insert graph. So now I've inserted my graph, and now I can actually start to look at what is the difference between trial 1 and trial 2. Once again, don't forget to highlight UGF and UGO so that you do get this nice little key on the side, which will tell you what is your data and what it looks like, okay? So after all of that, you guys, it looks pretty good. It makes sense that my finals are the same because I didn't change my final height, okay? So that might not be the case for you, but this is how you do potential energy. So now that you guys have learned how to do potential energy and kinetic energy calculations in Google Sheets, we're ready to set up your Google Sheet for the lab. So first you need to set up a column for all of your data. We know acceleration of gravity, you'll have the mass of your car, initial height of the ramp, final height of the ramp, initial velocity, and final velocity. So you should have all of those pieces in your Google Sheet. Those are all your data pieces so you can actually make the calculations. Then from there, you guys can actually put in what we're going to calculate. Let's look at everything in terms of their initial energy first, then final. So with this information, I can calculate kinetic energy initial. I can also calculate potential energy initial, and then I can calculate mechanical energy initial. Now, you might be thinking, mechanical energy, we didn't really talk about that one. Mechanical energy is really pretty simple. It's the combination of kinetic energy plus potential energy. So I'm sure you guys can figure out how to input that into Excel. Then over here, I want to do all my finals. I will have a final potential energy. You guys can make it K or you can make it KF, doesn't matter. Then I will have a final potential energy. And then I will have a final mechanical energy. I've also added in the equations at the top so you guys can just briefly look over it. Like I said, these are kinetic energy and potential energy initial. This is kinetic energy and potential energy final, all things that we already practiced. And then mechanical energy is just the addition of kinetic plus potential. Okay? So you guys should be good to go to get started, and good luck.